always seems this mic, me and this mic, we have this weird relationship with this microphone. Emily's looking at me like, I'm so sorry. It's okay, Emily, it's not your fault. It's me, it's really me. So hello everybody. Thank you for joining us for the January 2024 Legacies and Lunch. So previously to this January 2024, I think it was January 2020, right before the world shut down, we had a speaker who brought in 102 people. From now on, I'm just going to have railroad topics in January, because this is always kind of our like a low Sunday for us kind of deal. So yeah, so I'm going to have railroads from now on. So Mike, just go ahead and mark your calendar for the first Wednesday of every of January for the rest of your life. We'll have you come in. So I am Heather Registers the Benden, and like I said, this is the January 2024 Legacies and Lunch. So Happy New Year's. It's a hybrid program of the Cowles Butler Center for Arkansas Studies. If you don't know where the Butler Center is, it's across the street in that building called the Bobby Roberts Library. And it's on the second floor, and you can do all kinds of interesting research from genealogy and history and everything across the street. I am the Programs and Website Coordinator for the Roberts Library. Until hopefully the end of this year, fingers crossed, December 2024, we will be presenting Legacies and Lunch in this room here at UA Little Rock downtown. So I always like to thank Marta and Emily for having us, for giving us a home for this program while the main library is being renovated, because they have really good technology over here. If you want to sign up to get Robert's specific emails, so even if you get Cowles already, you know, you get library emails, if you just want to know what the Roberts Library is up to, then you'll want to sign up on the sheet there, please print, or me, please print, your email and your name, first name, last name, and I will get you added to our email list. You can also go to robertslibrary.org and sign up for yourself, and then I won't have to read your handwriting. So whichever works best for you, we'll figure it out. Please consider donating to the Cowles Foundation to support the programs of the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies and the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. You can go to robertslibrary.org or encyclopediaofarkansas.net to make a one-time or recurring monthly donation. We love those. Your support will be greatly appreciated and well used. So today's talk is being live streamed to YouTube and will be available to watch over and over again on Cowles' YouTube channel. So definitely check that out. We also have all of the programs we've been doing for a long time, but definitely every single program we've done since March of 2020 is on the YouTube channel. Today's speaker will take questions at the end of the session. For folks on Zoom, you can just type your questions in the chat box on Zoom and I will read them aloud. For everybody in person, if you'll please silence your cell phones, we would appreciate it. So today's speaker, that's the reason you're here. You're not here to listen to me go on and on about things. But I will say, I do have real life train experience. I have ridden the Texas Eagle and the Empire Builder and the Coast Starlight and the Zephyr. That was my honeymoon, and my husband he's not here today, but he has to be at work. But that was our honeymoon. That's the trip he wanted to take, and so we did that. Our anniversary is February 10th, so we did it in the dead of winter. It's very cold in Minot, North Dakota, in the middle of February. But it was a fun trip, and I really enjoyed it. And so yeah, so I married a train enthusiast, and I've given birth to a train enthusiast. So. We do a lot of trains in our household. We look for the Little Rock and Western all the time. We're always chasing that train. So now I'll turn it over to Mike. Mike is a retired civil engineering manager for the city of Little Rock and has done numerous presentations on early roads and places in Pulaski County. He is a regular program participant for the Pulaski County Historical Society, the Quapaw Quarter Association, and numerous other clubs and organizations. He's also the co-author of several articles on how the streets, roads, and places got their names, which is always entertaining. So if everybody will give a warm in-person and virtual welcome, here's Mike Hood.
Now, when it comes to train enthusiasts, my favorite quote comes from an old 1984 movie called The Big Chill. And in that old movie, actor Will Hurt remarks on his days as a disc jockey in Los Angeles. He said, "I have a small but deeply disturbed following." I got some of them folks with me today. They're sitting in the back row, they might be in the front row here too. I've been doing this talk a long time. This is what got me interested in history, and it has lasted 14 years now. I've been studying history, places, roads, look at everything I can, go to everything I can. But it all started because I found an old article written by the Saline County Historical Society, published by them, my friend Hanker, and he was a retired doctor, and he wrote all about Ferndale, the history of Ferndale, and I couldn't believe it looking at his old maps and article that a train went through Ferndale, Arkansas, little community, little Ferndale, Arkansas, USA, way out Cadis Road there. A train went through there. And that started me on a quest. I studied everything I could lay my hands on. I studied maps. I started looking at roads. I just had to know about this old railroad. All right. Now it's hard to imagine. It's not long ago. But in 1900, there was a vast stretch of virgin timber, never logged timber, that stretched from Pulaski County all the way into Oklahoma. No one ever logged it. It was still huge, old growth timber of all types. And it's as recent as 1900. Timber barons had found Arkansas. They were everywhere. First, they got the easy timber in South Arkansas. And Andrew Johnson Neimeyer, a man who owned a lot of railroads all across the Midwest, from Ohio to Iowa to Nebraska, got interested in, I guess you'd call it vertical integration, where you control the means of production and you sell it too. So he had an interest in acquiring timber, logging and sawing timber, and shipping it to as many lumber yards. Well, he got blocked to access to his timber down near Maumelle at Saginaw and decided to move to Little Rock. And that was in 1904. He started building a sawmill here in Little Rock. Now that come from the Historical Society. One of the members ran across it. That's a picture of the Neimeyer lumber camp train between Ferndale and Bigelow. This is a small engine. This is the Shea engine, the little ones they used on the rough logging roads, the rough temporary roads to haul timber in. The Shays were much different than the rod engines. This one was gear driven, it went very slow, but it could do steep grades, tight turns. Unlike the rod engines that were made from flat grades, hauling heavy loads at faster, higher speeds. This was the little workhorse. This is kind of the earliest replacement of mules, kind of, the little Shea engine. It was said that that little engine could do everything but climb a tree. They had great admiration for that, and the men who managed to run those up and down those old rough rails and logging roads that they built. Now, the Little Rock, Maumelle, and Western Railroad was incorporated separately from the Neimeyer Lumber Company, although it's hard when you read history to tell much difference between them. Evidently, there was some corporate advantage to having the main line railroad be its own, the Little Rock, Maumelle, and Western, but branch lines went out for miles and miles, and they were operated by the Neimeyer Company. And that's what the little Shea engines run up and down all the little branch roads. But the main line was incorporated as the Little Rock, Maumelle, and Western Railroad. Neimeyer purchased 80,000 acres, and I think that it was actually possibly more than that, because his brother also had a controlling interest in the railroad out of Bigelow. There was another competing railroad there, but it was two brothers, so did they really compete? They swapped land, they shared land. Land was cheap too. It's $3.50 to $7 an acre. If you did the math on that, inflation doesn't even match that. It's like they were giving the land away. And so he took a chance that there was enough timber there, and the biggest landholder in that part of the world at that time was the St. Louis Iron Mountain and Southern Railroad. They had received land grants to build their first railroad that arrived in Little Rock and in the late 1880s. And they still controlled a lot of land, and they owned it. They had used it as access to capital. And this was kind of some of the land nobody wanted. And he picked it up cheap. Him and his brother bought land, swapped land. They did anything they could to keep the Fourche Mountain lumber company busy over in Bigelow and the Neimeyer lumber company busy over here in Little Rock. The acreage extended deep into it went all the way across Pulaski County, all the way to the county line near an old place called Cold Spring. And it went on all the way to cross Highway 9 at the old lodge house at Perrin and way up into the branches along the North Fork of the Saline and the Saline. The old guy that runs the water reservoir at Winona said, I find those little branch lines everywhere out there when I'm out in that country. They're just everywhere, little old ghosts where you can see where the railroad once ran. This is a picture of the corporate officers. And I leave it up here because it's interesting to see. You know, it goes through the list of them and then it remarks the next two on the ends, I guess, the two of them near the end there. They don't know who it was. Well, hey, I eventually figured all that out. The man in the little white shirt with his hands in his pocket, he was a surveyor. And he did all the survey work. It was a very important job to lay out all these branch railroad lines that went everywhere and get them at the right grade and the right curvature that a train could actually negotiate them and get through the timber. And he went on to some notoriety anyway. I ran across the paper. He had published a talk he did at a Chicago Railroad conference. And then the second from the end, they don't know who it is. Well, that's Andrew Johnson Neimeyer. Look at him. He looks just like his brother over on the other end. I'm surprised that Fred Anchor didn't figure that out. In the book Sawmill, Kenneth Smith remarked that he looked more like a worried store clerk than the timber baron that he was. He owned so much timber, so much lumber, and was quite successful, although it ended in bankruptcy eventually. But that's a little jumping ahead of the story. The sawmill that he set up in Little Rock, just off Asher Avenue, was gigantic for the time in that it had two head saws, two of the main saws that sawed the logs first. They had other saw operations, resaw operations, they call it, where they actually made boards or straighter, better timber out of the initial cuts from the logs. But they operated two band saws full time, almost night and day. At least in the early parts of the operation. And it's powered by 825 horsepower boilers. That tells you a lot. And they use those boilers to power equipment and to generate steam to drive the kilns, to drive the lumber before it's shipped. And for Little Rock, it was quite exciting for the time. It was a big employer. You know, the Men's Business League was supporting this, way into it. They're the forerunner of the Chamber of Commerce. They loved the idea of getting this mill here and this new railroad in Little Rock. Pine lumber was the king. It's what it's all about. Now, don't worry, I won't have too many of these slides that are all words. I got some cool pictures too. You're gonna like, you're gonna really like it. But 40% of the timber was shipped out of Little Rock to all those mills over in the Midwest and Western states. But that meant 60% of it stayed right here in Little Rock and was sold. And you look around at all the beautiful old buildings. I'm sure some of you have an interest in, you know, for example, the tours the Quapaw Association gives every year. And some of these old downtown businesses where they're gigantic timber flooring. Hey, and a lot of it came from this operation. This was it. This was king. And that's where the lumber came for all those buildings that were built from about 1904 to 1921. It served other little industries along the way. The Clark and Gay Lumber Company was a hardwood operation, spindles and spokes and different things like that. And there was a smokehouse. You got to remember, refrigeration was kind of a new thing. You know, they had ice houses, but they're just perfecting the methods of ammonia refrigeration. Smokehouse, smoked meat was still a big deal. And there was a big operation right next door to the Neimeyer mill. And there was another smaller hardwood mill at what Neimeyer called cairn. Cairns means a rock pile or altar. And I'm not surprised at all that they would name a place out west Little Rock, rock pile. But I often wondered how they come up with a name like cairn. So maybe there was a monument there or some kind of Ebenezer. Marking something at that time. But it would be out where, somewhere about where Kroger is today, or maybe just a little bit to the east. There's an old map. There's a map from 1913, kind of showing how it laid out. The Neimeyer Mill there, that would be Elm Street, the street going north and south next to what's labeled as the Neimeyer Mill. The diagonal would be to Asher Avenue today. Back then, it was called the 19th Street Pike, because it connected up to what should have been the 19th Street in Little Rock, but actually Weldon Wright ruined all that and named it Wright Avenue, but that's another story. So they called that back in this day, the 19th Street Pike, Asher Avenue. You got Elm Street there. Their yard was actually over next to the Dickinson, Arkansas Brick and Manufacturing Company. I bet everybody in this room has seen those bricks with Dickinson stamped on them. Well, this is where they were made, and Dickinson was the president of Arkansas Brick and Manufacturing, and his name eventually became synonymous with that operation. Over time, it was acquired by different people, and today, the old, I guess, corporate structure is owned by Acme Brick. You can see above Dickinson's Brick and Manufacturing is where the old state penitentiary was, and way over to the right, across the railroad tracks from the current fairgrounds, was the old county hospital. One building still stands from that old mill. I about got run out of there one day, but my story of looking for the old Neimeyer Lumber Company, I guess, was so wild, the guy felt sorry for me. He goes, "Come on, I'll show you the last building." And he went and showed me the last remaining building of the Neimeyer Lumber Company. It was on a company that does truck brake repair. But he had some fun stories to tell, and I told him a lot about it. One building is still out there. And I bet you've driven down Asher Avenue and seen the old Neimeyer Mill. Well, that was the family operation. It was not Andrew Johnson or his brother Charles, but it was other family members of the Neimeyer that operated that. And back then, it was a big railroad operation, but it was a big mule operation too. You know, trucks were not developed in 1904. Automobiles were a novelty. There was only a half a dozen of them probably registered in all of Pulaski County. They still relied heavily on mules to skid logs over to the main line. And we'll go through some maps now where it all went. Everybody's always curious, where did the old railroad go? Well, down there at the bottom, it's kind of cluttered, I don't know, but there's the Neimeyer Mill down at the bottom there with the Arkansas Brick and Manufacturing. And it crossed Asher Avenue at the old Neimeyer Mill and went through the neighborhoods. And there it is, skirting all along ULR property. Now, over time, ULR has wiped out what little bit of trace you used to be able to see. They kind of first incorporated their parking lots and stuff right into where the old railroad went. Didn't change the grades at all. But now buildings have been added, dormitories, different things kind of obscured that. If you go up to the north a little bit, there's the old Methodist orphanage there. It's Methodist Family Life now. And behind that, there you can very clearly see an old cut in the hillside curving all the way around along behind the old orphanage. Now, the orphanage wasn't there then. That came in the 50s, but they went right around the hill and everybody left it alone, used it for water and sewer lines where the old railroad used to go, and crossed University Avenue in about the 1500 block. I've got a little branch shown going up to the Fairgrounds Park and the State Hospital for Nervous Diseases. Maybe someday I can tell you all about the Forgotten Dead at State Hospital Cemetery. That's a really spooky, great story to tell. But today we're talking about the railroad. After Neimeyer ceased operations, Missouri Pacific extended that spur line all the way in there, and they started having circuses and carnivals at the old Fair Park. And that's how all of it started, you see, because they had railroad access to that piece of ground where the carnivals and the fairgrounds and the circuses could all get into town. Then one of the carnivals left behind some animals, I think a timber wolf and something else. And before you know it, there's a zoo there and a park and a golf course, and it's still in use today because of that old railroad spur right there that come in along Coleman Creek. It curved and went across 12th Street up in this corner here and around behind the Haven Arrest Cemetery. The fence line of Haven Arrest is dead on the center of the old railroad right away, and went up across the interstate. Oh, backing up to the zoo, I threw this one in just for fun. There used to be a railroad displayed there at the zoo. A lot of people didn't remember that. And there was an old jet fighter too displayed over there. But that stayed there for a long time until they decided to take up the tracks. And Fordyce, the city of Fordyce, made a concerted effort to get control of that. And they towed it all the way down to Fordyce, where it's on display today in one of their parks. It went up around that diagonal there where I labeled Cunningham Lake and the Brady Place, and made the corner onto Markham Street. And they found timber and spikes and different things when they widened Markham Street years ago, still buried in the ground. And a lot of what I'm telling you today, I know to be true from aerial photography and written descriptions, but also we went out and found railroad spikes. We take a metal detector out and goes, yep, the railroad went right here. So I'm pretty sure what I'm telling you. It rode along 12th Street, Markham Street, by the ways out, and passed very close to the Ferdinand Canis homestead. Now, this is a little bit off the track, but I love telling these little stories about the old timers. Ferdinand Canis stopped in Little Rock on his way to Pine Bluff to look at a farm he was interested in buying. He had an old friend here, and he loved the area out what was then way out west of Little Rock, and set up a farmstead on Canis Road up at the top of the hill when you first come up from the bottoms of Canis Park. And he arrived in, I don't know, about 1878 or 75 maybe, with his whole family. And there's a photo of him, kind of, his whole family is there together. Little Edward on the far right side, he was a friend of County Judge Arch Campbell in years later, and convinced Judge Campbell, when he developed the new road plan for Pulaski County, to go ahead and name the old 12th Street Road Canis Road. That's how it all came to be. But it was an honor too for the family. They were very civic minded. They agreed to maintain and furnish all the lumber to build the first bridge over Rock Creek, so you didn't have to ford it there at that location. And they were very supportive of the county judge and just everything about their civic duty. They had quite an operation up there too, quite a farming operation. Their old house still stands, but I don't know how much longer it's gonna be. I heard one of the last relatives passed, Edwina Atchison, and the house has got a lot of privet growing around it now. That's the old original log home that's been up there since the 1870s at the top of the hill. You ride along a little bit further and you kind of get to an interesting place. You see the red, the little squiggly over on the far right. That goes through a city park. That's Rock Creek Park. And it's a little more than a walking trail, but a good portion of it follows right in the old roadbed. And I remember the current parks director, Leland Couch. I said, that's a railroad bed. And he goes, well, we always wondered that. I said, why's that, Leland? He goes, well, we found some railroad spikes. It was like, come on, Leland, you find railroad spikes right in the ground. Don't you think maybe that was railroad? They didn't just saw them there. They didn't dump them out there. And sure enough, that's the old railroad bed. I placed Carn Station, which I mentioned earlier, kind of in the Wellington area. That's how it scaled down for the old maps. But I really think it was probably over where it was a little flatter over towards the Shackelford Dairy. There's what it looks like when you're in the old Rock Creek Park going down through there. Real pretty walk right on top of the roadbed. Part of it got wiped out now in the tornado, but of course, that part of it wasn't where the railroad went. It went up through Parkway Village. You can see a little trace of the old railroad right next to Chenal Parkway at Loyola. You can look over there to the south and see, plain as day, the old railroad embankment coming in towards Loyola. In fact, years later, when they built a pipeline all the way from Lake Winona to Little Rock in the 1930s, they opted in many cases to lay the water line directly in the old embankment of the railroad. The dirt was there, it had been cleared, it was an easy, gradual grade, and oftentimes you'll find the water line was laid right in the railroad grade. And that's probably what we're seeing here. Right behind Walgreens at the drive-thru, you used to be able to look right through where Christian Brothers Automotive is and see that old cut there where the railroad went through there. That all got dug out when they built Christian Brothers. That's Highland Methodist Church that you're looking at there. I'm kind of sad to see over the years all the old railroad embankments disappear, but it's Little Rock, we're growing. can't last forever, but there's a few pieces way out in the county that might be there a long, long time. I hope someday they use more of that for a walking trail. Now, right about this area where Costco is and Kroger, that was all owned by Henry Houston Shackelford and his family. And his brother is how we got the name Shackelford Road. His brother Dennis was an attorney, a very successful one, and had a country home on Shackelford where Executive Center is today. And he's had beautiful orchards all over the property. That's how Shackelford Road got its name. But his brother practiced law with him for a time. Henry didn't like the law, and land was available cheap. And him and his brother had been speculating in real estate for years. And he announced that, I think I'm going to quit the law and I want to be a dairy farmer. I mean, talk about a Green Acres moment. Let's just quit our house in town, quit all those years of law practice. I'm going to go be a dairy farmer. Well, he had a young, beautiful woman as a bride, and she didn't like this at all. In fact, the family says she got on a train and left town for good. Bruce Shackelford was doubtful they ever got a proper divorce. They probably did some sort of court actions as abandonment, and he remarried a much younger woman. A lot of eyebrows were raised, a lot of accusations, but he married a much younger woman and raised a family there on his dairy farm, stretched all out there where Kroger is, going up the hillside for a long ways. See, don't you like those old stories? Yeah. Ways past Shackelford's old dairy farm, there was Lawrence Spring, or Lawrence. I don't know how the family would have pronounced that. Way back in history at Lawrence Spring, was a tan yard, where they tanned leather to make all kinds of leather goods. Very popular at the time, but very smelly. They were never located near town because tan yards smelled terrible. And still to this day, they call that little spot there Shady Grove. The yellow line going off near the top of the diagonal, that would be Danny Road, whoop, whoop. And then the road on the far right, that would be Chenal Parkway. Canis Road is the yellow line, kind of just a little bit south of the railroad tracks. And you kind of see it went the next hollow over from Canis Road is where the route of the railroad was. There was some amazing cuts in the dirt up there that I walked all over and looked at. And they did all that without machinery. I mean, down through 20 feet of shale. I don't know if they picked it out or blasted it out. They had dynamite, they had a lot of mules, but they did some amazing things all by hand to build that railroad, all just with mules. I doubt they would have ever brought in a steam shovel. I don't see any reference to that. In fact, most of the references are to hand building all of it. The old Lawrence house still is out there, Lawrence. How would you pronounce that? The spelling is correct, although there is old maps that spell it Lawrence. But that is the family name, and that was the name of that place. And that old home still stands there. I don't know its whole story, but it's still there, and it's mentioned on very old survey plats. Right next to Canis Road. As you're leaving, as you turn on to Canis from Kroger there and all that intersection, and go out that way, and the split after Denny, look on your left, and that's still there. And until just a few months ago, you could see the trace of the railroad to your right through that whole area, but construction now has obscured all that, dug it all out. It's all gone. But they found some spikes that they're looking. I mentioned the big cut. There it is. They cut all that down, and that picture doesn't do justice to how deep that cut was into solid shale all throughout that area. It's still out there everywhere, although that water line is near it in many, many places. Part of this cut became the stormwater detention pond for the new subdivision. When you go out a little further, you come to the old Crowson place, and right up from the old Crowson place is a very old one-room, little bitty Methodist church, Walnut Grove Methodist Church, that was almost lost to history. If it wasn't for some devoted folks over at Highland Valley Methodist Church, Peggy and Marty Taylor led that effort to restore that old church, it would have been gone and lost forever. It's not the oldest one-room church still standing in this part of the county, but it's close. And it is certainly the most true to how it was originally constructed. I think the Mount Pleasant Church over in Old Halstead on Lawson is a little bit older, but they didn't preserve it in its original condition. There it is today. It's beautiful. They still use it for like a Christmas Eve service, and they rent it out for weddings and different special events. And it's a quaint, beautiful old chapel. I just had to do a plug for it. I'm so glad they saved it. Up at the very top, you can see the trees make a curve and arcing pattern. See, that's kind of how I found some of this stuff. Today, I have a lot better topography I can study. Back then, I would just do it with aerial photographs and what I could with the maps at the time, 14 years ago. It's amazing how fast technology has changed. We use LiDAR surveys to get incredibly detailed topographic map data now that you can just so clearly see it, exactly where the old railroad embankments and cuts were. And it's like, oh, I did all that work. And now just a few years later, you just could open up a map and see it all. I like this little story too, but it's a little bit sad. The Croson's been out here for generations, probably since the 1840s or 1830s. Isaac Croson and Thomas Fletcher were the first documented residents to establish a permanent homestead in the Ferndale area. And the Crosson family, this would be, I don't know, third generation from Isaac or more. Winfield Crosson is the gentleman sitting there with a baby on his lap. And there's this whole family. And there's some fun stories about them. The oldest boy standing up, married into the Shackelford family. They had a lot of funny stories to tell me. Margaret Golden is married into the Crosson family. It had a lot of great stories and photos for me. The little fellow on the right with the funny hat, his name is Dub. Well, Dub, the family said probably he'd be diagnosed as being autistic today. He could never quite work on his own, always lived at home. When the family built a new home on their land, he lived in the old family cabin for the rest of his life. But you know, he had a special talent. He dug all the graves at the Walnut Grove Cemetery and could recite from memory every tombstone in that little cemetery. He probably had buried a lot of them in his lifetime, but he could remember every tombstone, every date in that whole cemetery. Well, tragedy struck, unfortunately. Oh, I didn't put that photo in. Well, there was a horrible accident one morning after heavy rains all night. There was a flash flood, and Winfield was taking his three little girls up to the one-room schoolhouse at Fletcher Creek, which is up on Canis Road. And some kind of weird dam or something gave way when they were crossing the creek, and the wagon was swept away, and those three little girls lost their life. And they were all buried together at the Walnut Grove Cemetery with a single marker. It was about 1925, and it made national news. It was a big, big deal for the time. Very sad. Years later, downstream at the Ouachita Gun Club, C. Winston Brown, a doctor who owned much of that gun club, found the ruins of the old wagon. Thought that was kind of interesting. Now, C. Winston Brown was a psychiatrist that worked with my wife. And one day she found out, well, C stood for Charles. And she said, well, Charles is such a pretty name, Dr. Brown. Why didn't you use that? And he goes, who wants to go see a psychiatrist named Charlie Brown? So he always went by C. Winston Brown. There we go. Whoops. All right, and then a little bit beyond then, the railroad stayed parallel to Canis Road. You can still go down some of the side roads and find it. It's very visible just off Roberts Road. Just as you start down Roberts Road, there's a little road to the right, very visible. You can go down to the end of that and see the old railroad coming down through the hills. And arriving here in Ferndale. And this is the Ferndale Crossroads. Back then though, there was no Ferndale. This was called Maumelle Junction. Maumelle being a reference to the Little Rock, being a reference to the Maumelle River, the Little Maumelle River, Maumelle Creek as it's mapped back then. And that's where the railroad's name came from. Little Rock Maumelle in Western is a reference to the Little Maumelle River. Now, he also operated branch lines all over in what today is the ranch off Highway 10, and all those subdivisions north of Highway 10 too still have traces of the old branch lines in them. But in that case, the Neimeyer Company hauled the logs out on the Rock Island. They had a switch at Pinnacle Valley Road that accessed all their timber holdings along Highway 10. And it's fun to talk about some of these old places. They're all gone now, but the Frank Post Office was down there. The Fletcher School was right across from Roberts Road. Maumelle Junction is right across from the Wooten Villa. That's a building that still stands to this day. The first resident of what would become Ferndale was over Dr. Sutton, operated a steam mill on part of the Ferncliff Camp property. Tram Road, the Garrison Road used to be called Tram Road. Just as a matter of trivia, there's the oldest house in Ferndale. I think there could be older ones, but it's certainly the most notable house in Ferndale. Horace Wooten, W-O-O-T-E-N, built that after a tornado came through, and they salvaged all the lumber and built this big, nice building. He operated the commissary at the railroad, and he took boarders in this house. Ferndale was the site of the first lumber camp that the Neimeyer Company established. And there was a lot of people living in Ferndale back then, which was nothing at the time. It really was nothing but a creek, a couple of creeks coming in together. But probably more than 100 people lived there, and maybe much, much more than that, because some of the men who worked the railroad brought their whole family. Everybody who could work did work. The women would cook and wash, and even young boys would go out and help however they could out in the timber. They set up camp all along Maumelle Creek and all up McFadden Creek, which today goes right through the heart of Ferncliff Camp. And it was blacks and whites together, working together, although they did keep separate camps. The blacks tended to be along McFadden Creek with the whites over towards the Wooten Villa, but they worked together all day long in the timber, loading cars, loading logs. And it was very much a joint operation in many ways. They, well, this is a little random, but Ferndale used to have a post office. It's right now it says Dr. Pepper, but Marcella Grimmett, who gave me a lot of wonderful pictures, says if you take that Dr. Pepper sign down underneath, it says post office. That is the world's smallest post office, I think. Wait a minute, now that's awesome. That's actually the world's smallest store, don't you think? I mean, how much stuff can you fit in a little bitty, tiny little place like that? Timber camps were a rough place to be, but you know what? They had a lot of comforts of home. They had a commissary owned by the lumber company. So yeah, you could have credit, but they're just going to garnish your paycheck to pay your credit. But they had a commissary. They had a doctor who made regular visits to the camp, inoculated people, care for them. There was an outbreak one time of a disease, and he came and gave shots to all the people in the camp and all the locals that had ever had contact with him. So they really tried to make a good effort at healthcare and provide for the workers. It was in their best interest. They lived in a lot of small 10 by 20 buildings and in tents. Here's one of the lumber camps, and I don't know where this is. This come to me from the family of Don Thompson, and it was photos acquired by one of their relatives named Prather Cyprick. So I'm sure that these pictures pertain to the Neimeyer camp, but I can't quite figure this one out. I think it must be at Cold Spring. That was their second camp, and I believe there was 3 camps total. The little arrow there is Prather Cyprick. He's a big man, and of course, there's a lot of big men there. And the guy all dressed in black right about in the center, his name is McEwen, and his family lived in Ferndale forever and ever. They're still there to this day. Melinda Glasgow's grandmother was a McEwen. A little bit of trouble on the back row there. I mean, they need to do it sometimes, you know, a little bit of fun. There's old Prather up on his team there sitting on a log. They would just drag the log or skid it if it was not more than about half a mile and the log wasn't too big for a single mule to drag. After a half a mile, it was not economical to try to drag those logs with mule down to the railroad sidings. So they would actually load them on a wagon, and they were some big logs. We talked about it being virgin timber that had never been cut. Well, take a look at those logs. And those very unusual wagons, they appear to have 4 axles, 2 of them steered. That was quite a feat for some carpenter to make a wagon like that would haul those big logs. 1 log, 2 mules, that was a heavy load. I suspect this picture is very close to Pinnacle Mountain, because there's Pinnacle Mountain, the second one in that series was 1913, and they seem to be working to remove material from underneath this trestle. And this would be a different railroad company. This would be the old Rock Island, which today is operated as the Little Rock and Western. Not the Little Rock, Maumelle and Western, but the Little Rock and Western is still in operation. It goes through the heart of the Pinnacle Park and all along on the edge of Maumelle Park. Goes all the way out to its headquarters at Perry. And then it still services some industries in Ola and in Morrilton. But that's an early picture of that railroad. It would have gone into operation in about 1903, and the tracks were still being improved and extended in 1913. You notice there's, look at how many trees aren't on Pinnacle Mountain in this photo. It looks a lot different today, doesn't it? There they are right beside the newly laid down tracks. Don't even have ballast in between the rocks, in between the ties. They got it all laid down, and I imagine that's a scene that was repeated over and over in the construction of the Little Rock, Maumelle, and Western. But I can't be sure if this is more of the Rock Island line. Apparently Mr. Seifert worked on it, or it was part of the Rock, Maumelle, and Western. But doesn't matter, same year, same type of operation. Get you a feel for what's going on. They loaded all the logs with little bitty steam log loaders. It was an American brand log loader, and it was very innovative how they did it. That little steam loader, little steam crane could move around all those flat cars from one end to the other. So when they finished loading one flat car, it moved down one and load the next flat car until it ended up either at the front or the back of the train, depending on what order they loaded. This is an actual picture near Ferndale, J engine number 50. You see how the boiler, the little round boiler of the train engine is setting offset from the coupler thing arrangement there? You see that little thing I showed you earlier on, that little Shay engine has a gear driven mechanism on its side. So the boiler had to be pushed over to one side, off center, unlike the rod engines where the boiler was always in the center. Good. This was their finest engine. It was bought new from the Baldwin Locomotive Works. It's unusual in the wheels are quite short, but that was done so they had more torque, less speed, working out the timber. Big locomotive, $15,000 in 1907. Like I said, the lumber camps moved. After they left Ferndale, the very next place they went to was at a place called Cold Spring. And if you've ever driven all the way out Canis into Saline County, there used to be, and I think though they've removed the old spring box to your left, was an old box in the side, concrete box in the side of the hill that called spring water, and everybody thought that was a very special, magical place. And right across from there is the new Cold Spring Event Center and the Cold Spring Cemetery. But if you went down to the south on Old Cold Spring Road, that's where the camp was all along Hog Creek. I think I got that right, Hog Creek. They would pack up their entire operation and move it, buildings and all. I don't think those are all box cars. I think those are little houses sitting on flat cars. They packed up all their houses and they're on to the next place. I think after they left Cold Spring too, I don't have a lot of evidence, but I believe they set up a Camp Perrin just off of Highway 9 out near today's Perrin. Back then it was two places. It was Brazos, where Perrin is today, and it was Perrin where I believe the lumber camp operated from. And that was probably their last camp before the operation shut down. We're getting really close to home for me now. I live just off Garrison Road. This route here with the red railroad line, that's Garrison Road. And before it was a Garrison Road, it was called the Tram Road. And there's still a remnant of something called the Tram Road way out there, but it's just one of the many hundreds and hundreds of branch lines that were constructed. The main road was Tram Road going all the way to the community in North Point, which is on Goodson Road at Highway 10. And it arrived very close to that. I traced the route all the way through the Somerset addition. And after that, it's kind of obscured, but several sources indicate that was the end of the Tram Road and the end of their logging operations to the north. I did run across some old remnants, an old cemetery and an old ruin of a steam mill right at the branch where Tram Road branched off and continued north and easterly and then went out west. And here's kind of a little overview, kind of a distorted overview of the whole thing. Something happened to that photo. Sorry, kind of an overview of the route. And if you want to, you can always send me a message and I'll send you back a little better quality of these maps if you like going out and looking for old ghosts and railroad spikes and everything else. One very interesting branch of it is in this far left side. This is an old map and I don't know how it got in there, but the lowermost red road that goes off the chart there, that's Striper Lane. If you want to go look for off Gaines Road for Striper Lane, it went up. You can see partway up Striper Lane where it came in and joined that road. And you can see at the top of the hill where it left that road and went all along the creek for miles and miles and miles, all the way to Cold Spring. And all those railroad grades are very well preserved. They're unused. They're very steep and rocky creek and the cuts are all still there. The railroad went out of business. It just, by 1922 or 21, all the easy to get timber they'd already cut out. Remember, they had made a big concerted effort to log this, to get all the timber out of there. And after World War I, about 1918, 1919, the lumber market collapsed. It had gone through the roof during World War I. Timber was in great demand. They were making money hand over fist, and all of a sudden the price fell down. And there was some dispute too with the crews that did the logging. Neimeyer would buy logs from private landowners if they could get them down to the railroad siding. And they think that some of the timber cutters were going working for private people and taking a cut of their timber instead of cutting company lumber. I don't know what happened. I think it's just a matter of economy. And I think it's just the mindset of the time too. The attitude of people who ran the lumber companies back then was to get out and cut out. They had no desire whatsoever to do sustainable forestry. They weren't even sure what it was. To them, you know, they were going to log it, they're going to sell the land cheaply and move on to the next place. And that's all they were interested in doing. And the company filed for bankruptcy. Now, don't feel too bad for Andrew Johnson Neimeyer. It ends up he moved to Burbank, California, lived a good long life out there in the hills of California. And he's buried right between his first wife and his second wife. I thought that was kind of unusual, but that's what happened to him. And his brother did well too, although he was left to kind of clean up the mess. Charles was appointed receiver for all the holdings of the Neimeyer company. He still had the Fourche River company over in Bigelow and the Fourche River and Indian Territory Railroad over there on that side of the world. But Charles cleaned up the mess and apparently everything well. I believe a lot of people got their money back, including the bondholders of the railroad company. The land wound up after that, a big bunch of Niemeyer's land, not all of it, but a big bunch of Niemeyer's land after that wound up in the Ferguson Ranch Company. John Ferguson from Broken Bow, Oklahoma, brought an entire herd of cattle overland in the early 20s and set up a ranch on all this western lands and wild lands out there. Unfortunately, he didn't last too long. By the time of the Depression, he went bankrupt too. You can see on the far left corner, there's a little obscure reference to Ferguson Ranch. And interestingly, that is also the site of a CCC camp. So they went through, cut all this timber. Then the Ferguson Ranch Company came in and ran cattle through all of it. And when he went broke, it was the Depression era, and they brought in the CCC to replant trees, build roads, and kind of try to restore all the mess that was left behind. And it looks like, based on this map, the CCC occupied the old Ferguson Ranch companies. I don't know that that was their headquarters, but it was certainly one of their operation headquarters. Down on Nowlin Creek, which you can see in the brightly colored greens, it was another camp down there also, and several other homesteaders. This map looks a little unusual because it's a soil map, but those soil mapping people made some great maps. They documented everything. I just love it. And after Ferguson went bankrupt, a bunch of the old timber company became the Pulaski County State Game Refuge. You know, in those years around then, this is a 1969 map of the road plan for Pulaski County. But back in the 30s that we're talking about, the game refuge started in 1940. There was almost no deer left in Arkansas. They had been hunted to extinction. Turkey was about gone. Western Pulaski County was the last refuge of the red wolf in Arkansas. And here we are, the biggest, most populous county in the whole state, still has this wild country just out west of here that's nothing but a bunch of trees and wildlife. But that's another story. I'm working on a whole story I can tell you about the old state game refuge in the Ferguson Ranch. You know, they still had cattle drives up into the 30s from out there all the way into downtown Little Rock. What it'd be like, look out, driving your Model T and all of a sudden there's a herd of cattle you gotta wait for. Nowadays, it's all owned by Potlatch Delta Timber Company, and lots of hunters and joyriders are out there every day cruising the old timber. They discovered sustainable forestry. They found a way to make it all pay. That little red buggy there is mine, and right next to it is an old Jeep owned by one of my friends back there. And we just love this country. And that's why I like telling this story, because that's home for me. Found an old grave, an old Palmer cemetery, and it was hard to find. I went to see an old resident out there, Mr. Kirkpatrick. Dude says, man, you're looking in the wrong place. You need to be looking on the old road. And I finally, after about a half a day of wandering through the woods, found that old cemetery. But I kind of wished I had them. It's sad how all the men and all the people and the families and the women work so hard and make homesteads out there, and it just ends up all forgotten. Time was long, long ago. They were there when they logged the timber, and they stayed probably till the Depression, and that was the end of their residence out there. Oops. Well, I'm so sorry about that. There should be one other picture, but there's not.
It's not.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
We're gonna have to pass this mic around, this mic, not that mic. Questions?
One day we're.
Wait, let me give you the mic for the people on. Sorry.
When they were getting the logs out of the forest, putting one of those wagons, how did they get those big logs up on the wagon?
I asked that same question. It ends up they would take and load from the side, and they would lay poles on against the wagon and on the ground. And then they had a very interesting arrangement of a rope or a chain that went around under the log and tied to the wagon. And as they pulled that chain up, the log would roll inside of the chain on up into the wagon. And when they got to their destination, they would just shove it off the pole, let it roll.
I do a real good Phil Donahue.
Was all this standard gauge?
Yes.
It wasn't narrow gauge?
There's a lot of folks that have a misconceived notion about that. They like to think that it was narrow gauge, but it was not. When you say tram road, what you're saying is that it was a road that was built only for the Shea engines. It had steeper grades, sharper curves, it was less level, it's made for low speed. And that's what a tram road references. All these were standard gauge and they interchanged frequently with the St. Louis Iron Mountain and Southern. In fact, the heavy maintenance on the engines was all done at the Iron Mountain shops in North Little Rock. So they had to be able to travel on the main line. And likewise, they had a second logging operation over there near Pinnacle Park and the ranch. And so they had to be able to access that main line of that branch of the Rock Island.
Other questions?
I know you have written for the Pleasant County Historical Review. Have you written any books?
Or EOA articles?
Also, you know, I was good friends with Dr. Richard Clark, and he passed here just this last year, and I worked on stories with him all the time. Things like Edward Rodney Parham and Deadly Care of Cantrell and Ferdinand Canis and how all the roads got their names today. I've got a lot of material, but I've never really done anything with some short stories.
Richard introduced us.
Yeah.
Do you want, Guy, would you like to make?
I do want an encyclopedia of Arkansas entry.
Guy Lancaster would like an encyclopedia of Arkansas entry on this railroad, but in anything else as well.
Well, I'd be glad to do it. It's one of my favorite topics. I've done this one more than any other thing I've ever done. You know, I've got some other popular ones, but this has always been my favorite.
We let you know, do the game refuge
Say that.
story. We does the game refuge story. We'll hear that.
Game refuge story, and I
Game refuge?
thought the place names might be interesting too. Watch it, Mike, you're gonna be here every month. You can all show up, definitely.
On street names.
Who is Markham?
I don't know. All right. After talking to a lot of heavyweights like Bill Worth and a bunch of other folks, we decided that there was 2 or 3 Martin brothers. We don't know where they came from, what happened to them, what they were doing in Little Rock, but they apparently laid out the first street of the future town of Little Rock and left. Nobody seems to know. If anybody can solve that mystery, it'll be a major big deal. But nobody knows who the Markham brothers were. We know they were brothers.
Any other questions?
I have a question that's kind of off topic, but,
Okay, hang on, let me get.
well, on one of your slides there, where it had Asher Avenue and the Neimeyer mill and stuff, and it had the state penitentiary. 1913. I'm assuming that's where they moved the state penitentiary, where the state capitol is?
Yes, sir.
And how long did the state penitentiary stay there? Do you have any idea?
I'm not exactly certain, but by around World War II, I believe someone else may know better. They had started to buy those old plantations and put the prisons there.
But they had just moved, I guess, over there in 1913.
Yes, that's correct.
to build the capitol.
They'd abandoned the old penitentiary site for the new state capitol, and they chose the site over off what today is Roosevelt Road. Then it was 26th Street. Yeah, which Roosevelt is it named for? Got 2 guesses.
FDR.
Yes, it is, FDR. Teddy Roosevelt had one up in the Heights area called Alden Lane. He lost his street. They couldn't have 2 Roosevelts, so Teddy lost out. FDR won.
Any other questions? Oh, sorry, John. You're over here on the side.
CCC camp you reference, is that where the Girl Scout camp is, on Lake Sylvia?
No. All right, I'm gonna confess, I'm guessing a little bit that the old Ferguson Ranch headquarters become a CCC camp because that road is officially named the CCC road. And there's the ruin up there, there's a spring box, you can see where the old shower house was, you can see where the old kitchen and barracks was by the foundation layout. And so it was a definite important camp for many years, now just the logging companies. The hunters is all that's out there now today. But it's on top of Mossy Mountain, or on the shoulder of the top of Mossy Mountain, and the other Rattlesnake Mountain. We just named one of the Maumelle Pinnacles Rattlesnake, and I don't know why they didn't look at the maps, because we already had a Rattlesnake Mountain. But, hey, I'm not the promoter of parks departments. So that's how that all goes. But the old Lake Sylvia camp was actually part of the holdings of the other brother, Charles Neimeyer, and the Fourche River Company. And their camps extended all the way to Lake Sylvia. One of their last camps was at Lake Sylvia, very, very close to that. In fact, there was a railroad spur in the bottom of the lake that's documented on an old map. So that's how that became. After the logging companies left, the CCC came in, and you know the rest of the story.
Well, thank you, Mike, again. We really appreciate it. I'm gonna get over here to the podium. Everybody give Mike a round of applause. I'm going to rewatch this several times and study those maps, because for almost 20 years, my husband's been saying, see over there, that little clearing, that's it. And so I'm gonna now be able, when we're driving to Home Depot or wherever, I'm gonna go, see right over there, that little clearing. So yes, thank you, Mike, for that. On a personal note, thank you for that. Okay, so before everybody leaves, especially because I got such a great group, couple of program announcements. Second Friday Art Night is still a thing. If you didn't know it was a thing, it is a thing, and if you forgot, it still is. So you can join us on the second Friday of every month, which this month is this Friday the 12th, at Rocket Lab, which is the former Cox building, which is the triangle building over there across the parking lot. Bring a friend, bring a date. Come and make a night of art and music and mingling. We're there from 5 until 8, and all of these activities for Art Night are underwritten by the Wingate Foundation. And finally, next month, we're going to have members of the 1963 class from Horace Mann High School to come and talk about their experiences in Little Rock in the early 60s, as well as kind of what high school was like after 57. So if you will mark your calendars for Wednesday, February 7th at noon, we will be back here. You get a free cookie if you come in person. If you join us on Zoom, you got to get your own cookie. So thank you again for showing up on this new year, and we'll see you next month.